From 2014 through 2016, I traveled throughout Lebanon for the film Finding My Lebanon. From interviews with journalists, cultural icons, visionaries, and artists, I came to understand a society that few can define. A culture of uniqueness that shuns xenophobia, a desire to enjoy the moment, regardless of the political and economic realities of that moment. These are the Lebanon Tapes, the complete, unedited interviews from that time. Robert Fisk was known among his colleagues as the first journalist in conflict for his work in wars around the globe and especially throughout the Middle East. His book, Pity the Nation, was my first true understanding of Lebanon's recent history of conflict and a culture that can survive any invasion. In this interview, one of the last before his death in 2020, Fisk discusses how and why Lebanon became his de facto home for over 20 years. Does that happen every day?
Yes, 3 hours a day, every day.
Come early. Okay, if you would introduce yourself.
My name's Robert Fisk. I'm the Middle East correspondent of the British newspaper The Independent, and I've lived in Lebanon for 39 years.
When did you first come to Lebanon? What was your first experience?
June 1976. The Syrians had entered Lebanon the previous day with armoured vehicles and tanks. I was actually in Israel, and I rushed to Jordan and took a plane to Beirut. The airport was open. And within 24 hours, I was watching Syrian tanks pouring across the Bekaa Valley. They hadn't yet reached Beirut, where the civil war was going on. I remember on the flight, on the MEA flight, Lebanese Airlines, they didn't have any food. I was sitting in first class. They actually had first class in those days. And so they came and gave me a big bottle of whiskey, and I said, "What's this for?" And the stewardess said, "You're going to need it." That was my introduction. I'd actually been to Lebanon on holiday before. When I was in Belfast, and this place was peaceful, I came here on a holiday from Belfast to get away from Northern Ireland. So I actually saw Lebanon at peace before the war, just for a week. I went to Baalbek, I went to the Roman ruins, but I also went to Tripoli in the north, and the army was trying to put down some kind of militia that had taken over the souk in Tripoli. And I remembered seeing all these soldiers wearing steel helmets and thinking, this is not a normal country, there's something wrong here. This wasn't the war, it's long before the war, 2-3 years before the war. And I remembered thinking when I left and saying to myself, this is a strange country, Lebanon, there's something wrong with it. I'd been in Belfast, so I could see a city that was gone wrong, and Tripoli was. And when the war started here, I was covering the aftermath of the Portuguese Revolution, and I wasn't at all surprised when I realised there was a civil war going on here. It was fairly predictable, I thought.
How has your view of this being a strange country, as you said, has that changed?
Oh, of course. I mean, when you spend more than half your life living in a country, you change your views on it, and you never cease to learn about it. I learn more about Lebanon every day now, as we're speaking. When I go shopping this afternoon, I'll learn something more that I hadn't thought of. No, I mean, one feels a lot of affection towards a country which you've lived in for a long time because you know it so well. You know the streets, you know the countryside, and you know many of the people. I often have dinner with politicians here and so on. And very often you can pick up very good stories in Beirut about other places like Saudi Arabia because everything passes through Beirut. You don't need to go to Saudi Arabia. It's a good idea to go, but I mean, you don't have to go. So you learn an awful lot, and this is the most educated Arab country. They read books, they love books. They love politics rather too much. But it's also a very tragic country because since the French arrived after the First World War, they effectively instituted a sectarian system of government here, which today, as you know, since the French arrived after the First World War, they instituted, in effect, a sectarian system of government. It's not the same now as it was under the French, but it's still sectarian, where the president has to be a Christian Maronite, and the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of Parliament has to be a Shiite Muslim, and a Shiite cannot become the president, and of course a Sunni cannot become the Speaker of Parliament. or the president. And what's happened is that if this is to be a modern country, like a European country, let's say, you have to get rid of confessionalism. But you can't get rid of sectarianism in this country because it's part of the identity of Lebanon. It's how the country works. In other words, it's like a beautiful Rolls Royce. It's got flat screen TV, cocktail cabinet in the back, new leather seats, but square wheels. It doesn't work. And that's the tragedy of Lebanon. It cannot work, and it's not meant to work.
You have worked and lived in so many countries, in so many situations. Why Lebanon?
Well, if you're going to cover the Middle East, which is what I do, Lebanon is a place where you can get things done, the phones work properly, you can get on board a plane 20 minutes after you arrive at the airport if you know the right people to talk to. It's the most educated Arab country. The people are very smart, very talented in the most literal sense of the word. It's a country where people are unfailingly kind to you. And I learned a lot here during the war. I learned how to stay alive here. I'm very grateful for that. When I was badly beaten on the Afghan border in 2001, after 9/11, by a group of people whose families had just been killed in an American air raid, I remember people were bashing stones into my face with their hands. And I remember the Lebanese who told me during the war here, years before, if you're in danger, whatever you do, don't do nothing. And I started hitting these people with my fist, and they moved back away from me. So that's probably Lebanon saving my life a little bit there. But I remembered the person actually saying, I had two quotations I remembered. The man saying to me, in danger, whatever you do, don't do nothing. And the other moment was when I was staring at the side of the bus that was next to me, laminated, painted side of the bus, and I could see myself covered in blood from head to foot, just scarlet with blood. And I remembered that quotation from Lady Macbeth after King Duncan's death. Who would have thought the old man had so much blood in him? That was the second quotation I remembered there.
That's why Lebanon, but why is your home?
Well, I don't own this house, it's still rented. I have a home in Europe. But why is it still home? Well, I think that, it's rather like having a good credit with a bank. When you have so many contacts, when you know a place so well, when you know how quickly you can get to other countries in the region, when you know the story well, why throw it all away and go somewhere else? When I first came here, it was a 3-year assignment for the Times of London. This is before Murdoch took it over. And I thought I'd probably spend 3 or 4 years here. The war had already started. We didn't know how long it was going to last. And when wars go on, you never think they're going to end if you're in them. You assume they're going to go on forever. They do end, of course. And by the time it ended, I'd been here for 14 years. And I had all my friends here. I had the places I liked having lunch with them. I knew where I could go to listen to beautiful concerts of orchestral music. I used to play the violin when I was at school, so I'm still crazy about classical music. And there's another great thing about Lebanon. I mean, it is an immensely cultural place. Art, painting, music. Most of the great orchestras of Europe come here at one stage or another. And there is obviously a strong French element to Lebanon, which goes back to the 1860s, of course, when the French first became seriously involved. And I speak French fluently, so I find there's a certain French element to Lebanon. The newspapers, the French language paper carries a very good literary section, which I always read. So after a while, you become very familiar with the place, and it becomes home to you, and you don't want to leave it. I got married here in Lebanon because I thought it was the most. I got married at Baalbek because I wanted to see the Roman ruins in the background. So a lot of my life has gone into working here, and a lot of danger too. There have been some Israeli invasions in which I've had friends killed and almost got killed myself, and you remember this sort of thing, you know, it has an attachment. But I can go past the places where I almost died and not even think about it. I've been here long enough that I can go around Beirut. I can remember once seeing a car bomb had gone off and a woman had become trapped and was burning alive in her car. And a French soldier, it was just after 82, was trying to smash the window to help her and couldn't because his hands were burning. And she died in the car. And I realized the other day I was with the guy who used to be my driver. He's retired now, but he still drives me occasionally. And he mentioned it to me, and I'd completely forgotten. But I'd driven over that bit of road where that happened many, many times without thinking about it. You can forget these things. You don't forget them. You can remember them if you want to, but you don't recall them every time you're at the place.
The French were notorious in their colonialization for, well, many of the countries they left behind are still trying to recover. Lebanon seems had a different...
Well, I know you're not going to use this because you're not going to reply to your question, but it was not colonized Lebanon like Algeria was. You have to always make a distinction between Lebanon and Algeria. Algeria was colonized, it was part of France d'Outre-mer, it was part of the state of France. Lebanon was never. It was only, France was only given a mandate by the League of Nations after the Treaty of Versailles, and its mandate was to run Lebanon until it could be given independence. Of course, the French tried to stay on, and General de Gaulle did not want to give up Lebanon, but in fact, the British actually ordered troops to surround French barracks in Syria to drive them out if necessary at gunpoint during the Second World War, an untold story of the Second World War, and the French agreed to go, and they left, of course, in 1946. The Christians, very unwisely here, still lock themselves into France too much, I think. You know, they've got the presidency, and they're only about 30% of the country. That's a pretty good going for them. Of course, they had 51% of the country were Christians when the French last held a population census here. Since everybody knew that the population census was soon going to show that Christians are a minority, there were no more censuses in Lebanon, though we know roughly, you know, how many people are in each different community. The largest individual community are the Shias now, but they're not a majority, so as long as that stays like that, Lebanon's still okay. But no, what the French did is what the British did in Iraq and what the British did in Cyprus and what the British basically have done in Northern Ireland. They've instituted sectarian governments. And that's what the French did here, and so we're stuck with a sectarian country.
Can we speak about Lebanese culture?
I'm not sure if Lebanon, you know, Lebanon has a culture in terms of its food and its manners and its people. And there are certain individual musicians like Golmier, for example, who are clearly Lebanese in inspiration. But you only have to look at art galleries here to realize, for example, that much of the art done by Lebanese is very... You only have to look at art here, for example, to see that it's very derivative. It's always taken from somewhere else. And there's a strongly derivative quality about Lebanon itself. You know, the food is basically Turkish, but of course that comes from the Ottoman Empire. Its greatest ruins are Roman or Crusader, and they came from Europe. Though there are Phoenician ruins of great beauty. I think that, you know, the culture of Lebanon is trading right back to the Phoenician days. The Lebanese were very shrewd traders and seafarers. That's where Carthage comes from. They were Lebanese, Phoenicians. There's a very good story I read many years ago in Cairo of how when the pharaohs were losing their standing in the Middle East, when they were breaking up of civil wars in Egypt, the pharaoh used to come into the port of Byblos north of here, and there'd be a huge ceremony to greet him. And then as the pharaohs lost their standing, one of them wrote back to Egypt that he was kept waiting 3 days in Byblos before being received. The Lebanese had worked out he wasn't worth anything anymore.
The Lebanese
it's a myth. I came here for a holiday before the war, in the early 70s, before the war. And if you stayed in a beautiful hotel in Beirut and you believed in this rubbish about the Paris of the Middle East, fine. But the moment you went to the Bekaa Valley, or you went to South Lebanon, which I did because I wanted to see the Israeli border, you found the people there didn't have any electricity. They didn't have fridges. And many of the villages didn't have schools. This mythical period was great if you had a lot of money and you arrived from Europe. And the Lebanese would, flaunt their possibilities in front of you. But if you didn't have money and you were Lebanese, you lived in great poverty. And with the total lack of care by any authority, the government didn't care about people in the south. That's why the Shiites became so powerful when Amal was created, then Hezbollah. They didn't care about the people in the Bekaa Valley. They didn't care about the people in the Yarkub and the Sunnis who lived north of Tripoli. They lived in poverty and sweat. And only when you had money, or you ran a bank, or you were a trader, or you were a politician, one of the Zorma, the great families, then you could say you were living in paradise, yes.
Going back for a second to the traders, or merchants of diaspora, as they've been called by others, do you think that makes them more successful in immigration?
Oh yes, undoubtedly. I mean, there's a huge... I notice this because I travel around the world a lot giving lectures on the Middle East. And, I turned up at Sao Paulo on the first trip I'd ever made to Brazil, and I was staying in a Lebanese-owned hotel, which had a Lebanese restaurant. Unfortunately, the last thing I wanted to eat when I'm away from Lebanon is Lebanese food. And quite a lot of hotels in New York are owned by Lebanese. I found myself staying in out of the blue. And I'm constantly meeting Lebanese whose families emigrated, say, to Latin America or to Europe more than 100 years ago. There were quite a lot of Lebanese from one village, even on the Titanic. That shows you they were travelling then. There was great starvation here during the Ottoman Empire. And they were waitlisted on the next ship out of Le Havre and got on the Titanic. Only one survived, a young woman who jumped into the sea and swam and clung onto a piece of wreckage and was saved. And she became a millionaire. She went into the lumber trade in Canada. And all the others from the village died. I've been to the village. And they still want compensation. But of course, it was the First World War after the Titanic. And the White Star Line wouldn't pay any compensation to people who were the enemy, Ottoman Empire. That's how history strangles you, isn't it? The other thing you should know about Lebanon is people here are very brave. They fight hard. They drove the Israelis out. They're the only country to have ever driven the Israelis out. They just fought and fought and fought and fought and fought. They know how to fight. I'm not sure what they're always fighting for. I know who they're fighting against, but I'm not sure what they're fighting for. But Lebanese people are very brave. I mean, a lot of people said when the Syrian civil war started that Lebanon would have another war. And I was going on local television stations saying it won't. You're bright people in this country, you will not have another civil war. Because during the war, a lot of Lebanese left. A lot of Lebanese families sent their children to Geneva, New York, London to be educated. And so they came back and they're now approaching middle age and they're very, very well educated, speak many languages. They will not permit another war to happen here.
Speaking of the children, it's common practice, is expected in past years that people would go away and make their life.
Why did they come back, you mean?
I've been told now that a lot of them are actually coming back and making their life here.
Well, the ones I know are coming back, but they're not all staying. They're coming back and giving it a go for 2 or 3 years and deciding it doesn't work, and then leaving again. But you've got to remember that a huge amount of money comes into this country from expatriates, particularly from what was French West Africa, for example. Diamond trade in Antwerp, a lot of Lebanese involved in that. So a huge amount of money comes into this country. It's a very expensive country to live in, very expensive apartment to run. This is not a cheap place at all. And the standards of living are very high compared to other countries in the region, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. And I think there's no doubt that, if you know the history of a place well, and you live reasonably well there. You can enjoy your life, and I enjoy my life here very much. It's not safe, of course. I mean, there are bombs still in Lebanon. And just before Christmas, the Iranian embassy was bombed. I was very close to it. I mean, I saw it go off. Rafik Hariri, I was walking on the Corniche when he was blown up. Only a few hundred meters away from me. I saw fingers of the explosion going up like this right in front of me. Everyone in front of me was hurt except for me. I was just far enough away I wasn't touched. So I saw all the palm trees bending with the blast. And you realize always, sometimes if you know this place as well as I know it, you can get up in the morning and sense that something is wrong. I said to my wife one day, I said, there's going to be an explosion today. There's going to be a bombing. I felt it because people weren't walking normally. People weren't talking the normal way. The bomb was the next day, actually. I was wrong by 24 hours.
I've been told that the Lebanese war is only a marker on the timeline. They talk about before it and after it.
Well, I think we talk about before and after the Second World War, don't we, in Europe and America probably. Or you'd probably talk about before and after the Vietnam War. I think people, yes, it would be a timeline. It's the mark between age and youth, isn't it? People who don't remember the war would have been children or would have been born afterwards. That's all it is. But it doesn't have a meaning, I don't think, like that.
I've been told, and I've seen myself, that Lebanese are somewhat like the bride on the cross. Always look on the bright side of life and death.
Yes, I saw that film for the first time only a few years ago. Very sad film too, isn't it? No, I think it's a cliche. Lebanese are not all the same. There are national characteristics in countries, we know that. But I think I think the idea of a country being reborn is very strong in Lebanon. The idea that you can make the future work. It doesn't make the future work for all the reasons I explained, because politically this country doesn't work. But I think they have an enormous capacity to enjoy life in a way that we, perhaps in the West, have lost a bit. To enjoy weddings in a way that we've lost. To the sort of joie de vivre, to use a French cliche, is never really died out here. It remained. And I think there's an enormous capacity to see that life is basically good. Although if you see some of the Syrian beggars who are sitting on the corners of streets, it probably doesn't seem that good to them.
On a personal note, what's your favorite Lebanese food?
Hummus. I've got some in the fridge now for lunch. No, actually, probably sambusa kshibni, which is a kind of a fried cheese roll. Or manushi would be where you have hot cheese inside Lebanese bread, which folds over itself. I love having manushi for breakfast.
And finally, based on what you said about the culture, do you think there can ever be a stable future for Lebanon?
Well, it can't be a modern state, so it won't have a stable future. And unless there's a peace in the Middle East based on justice, not on what the State Department or Israel thinks, there will never be stability here. As long as the Palestinians do not have a state, and as long as a state of war exists in the Middle East, this country will be bombed.
I'm Mark Abizaid, and these are the Lebanon Tapes. To watch other episodes or other films by Real Lives, please log in to YouTube's channel, reallives.ngo.